Hello everybody. This is the assembly guide for the Pump Skewer V2. So this is the current release pump skewer as of July of 2022. Um, if it's been a while since this video came out, I recommend that you go to the GitHub page for the pump skewer and check if there are any revisions. If there are revisions in there that would change the way that the assembly goes, I will mention it in the changelog at the top of the page. Let's begin. I'm not doing this assembly guide with an actual blaster because I already have my pump skewer assembled and I don't want to disassemble it just to reassemble it for video when I can probably make a better video by just showing it to you with the files. Let's begin. So, this is the pump skewer V2. Yeah. First off, we'll start with assembling the grip. The grip on the pump skewer V2 is the same assembly as the grip on the regular skewer. So to assemble this, you start with this white piece right here. You take this back strap and you slide it onto it. And then you put a screw in right here on the back. Once that is done, then take your piece of elastic, tie a knot on one end of it, and then push the other end through this hole, going through both this back strap piece and this white piece. And that will come out the top right there. Then you push that elastic through the hole in the bottom of your trigger and the hole in the bottom of your sear. Pull that elastic until it is mostly tight. Tie a knot on it and make sure that the knot is nice and tight up against the top of the sear. And then make sure that the knot sits in this cavity right there in the sear. At that point, you can let go of your elastic and test your trigger, just seeing if it is being returned. As long as it's not like loose, you'll be fine. At that point, you can hold your trigger in place right here and push a pin. Actually, no, never mind. Sorry. At this point, you can take your trigger, which is this piece. Damn it. At that point, you can then put a screw into this hole right here in the front of the grip. Go all the way in, put the screw all the way in. Then you can line up your trigger right here and push a small roll pin through the side of the blaster, or the side of the grip, through the hole in the trigger and into the hole on the other side of the grip. So you want to have a pin bridging this gap right here, holding the trigger in place. You can then push in the pin all the way with a small drill bit or a piece of filament or something thin. Make sure that it's all the way in, and then put another screw through this hole. These two screws keep the roll pin from wiggling its way out and falling out of the blaster. At that point, you can then take your sear back here, push your standoff through the hole in the sear right there. Depending on when your kit is made, it might be a 440 metal round standoff, or it might be a nylon, little nylon cylinder, which will be shaped like this. In that they both work the same, but you put that there. You attach this part, which is your sear block. You just hold it up to it, and then you put a screw in through the side. Do the same with your other sear block. At this point, you can check that your trigger is working correctly. So you will hold these sear blocks in position with the rest of the grip, since I don't have threaded rod going through them yet. So you just need to hold them in place like this. Then you can pull your trigger, and when you pull this trigger backwards, you want this bit to go down. So this will pivot like that. Just like that. And then this should pivot like this. Just like that. If both of those went well, then you are done with the grip. Next, we will assemble the magwell. The magwell on the Pump Skewer V2 is also assembled the same way as on the regular skewer. You will take first, you will take your white magwell piece, which is this part right here, and you will take your mag release itself right here. First, put a screw through this hole. This will be basically the same process that we did for the trigger on the grip. So put a screw through this hole, put a pin through this hole right here, through the mag release, and bottom it out against this screw over here, which is a backstop for it. Make sure that's pushed all the way in with a piece of filament or a drill bit or something else thin, and then put this second screw right there. Next, you take a piece of elastic, tie a knot on one end of it, thread the elastic through this hole here, across this part right here, which has a cutout for it, and then into this other hole over here. Hold the elastic nice and tight as you put in a Talon magazine to test the strength of the elastic. Once your Talon magazine is held in place adequately enough for you, you may then tie a knot on the other piece of elastic and let go of it. You then cut off the excess elastic and use a lighter to clean up the ends of the elastic so it doesn't fray. At this point, you can then put on this bottom piece. This bottom piece slides on like this with a small dovetail right here, as you can see there. Slide it on, and then put these two screws in place. That screw and that screw in through the bottom of the piece. That will keep it attached to this white piece. At this point, if your magazine is held in adequately enough for you, then your magwell is done. At this point, you can then trim any excess elastic that might be coming out the bottom of the grip or out the top of the grip along the sear. Make sure that is trimmed far enough that it doesn't have a lot dangling off, but not too far, because if you trim it off too far down close to the knot will unravel. Once it is trimmed, then take a lighter and hold it over the ends of the elastic. That will make sure that it doesn't fray over time. At that point, your grip is done. Next, we will assemble the plunger. The plunger for the Pump Skewer V2 is made out of two printed parts. It is worth mentioning that the Pump Skewer V2 plunger is the same dimensions, more or less, as the V3 Talon Claw plunger. So if you have a V3 Talon Claw, acetal plunger, or normal plunger, or metal plunger, odds are it will be compatible with the Pump Skewer V2. Let's move on. To assemble your plunger, take this orange piece right here and put one of your dash 1, 2, 3 O-rings on the end of it. Then get your white piece and line it up with these 3 holes. Put screws into these 3 holes. At that point, your plunger is done. If you are building the pump skewer V2 with a full spring guide, the assembly is different. Take your orange piece and put the O-ring on it, as was the same on the last one. However, at this point, you then take your piece of barrel or CPVC pipe or whatever you are using as your spring guide and put it into the end of that orange piece. Put super glue inside of this hole, then put on this piece, this pipe. You want to put in the pipe before you super glue it, just to make sure that it fits. If it doesn't fit, clean out the hole with sandpaper or a file or an X-Acto blade. Once it does fit, then put on the super glue, then put it into the hole. At that point, you can then take your white piece and push it on like this, onto the pipe from the back. Once it is approximately in this position, put more super glue along the back face of this orange piece. You can then slide this all the way on and hold it in place there until the super glue sets, or until you are sure that it won't fall off if you don't hold it on. You could also just put a clamp on it, or a small clamp across it to hold the pieces together until the super glue sets. At that point, your plunger is done. We will now be assembling the stalks for the blaster. There are several different stock options, so if you are using any of these, I don't know, this is an awful way of saying this. Next, we will assemble the stock for your blaster. I'm going to cover assembly for all the different stock options that are currently released. If you see a stock option here or if you don't see your stock option here, that means that probably got made after this video was made. So look for instructions on how to assemble that. I'll probably have text instructions for that in the video description or the description on GitHub. To assemble your stock, first off, there are 3 different stock options that require no assembly. That is the no stock plain version, the end strike stock, and the buffer tube stock. We will cover how to assemble these when we put the full blaster together. We will cover what to do with these when we put the whole blaster together. But for now, just know that there isn't anything to assemble with these. You can just set this part aside. If you are using the fixed stock kit, which is the one with longer threaded rods, your stock will be a print, and you will also have a printed spacer. If you have the fixed stock version of the kit, which is the one with longer threaded rods, your stock will be fully printed. It is this back piece, and it will be this printed middle piece. You might also use these rod covers instead of the printed metal piece, or printed spacer piece. You may use these rod covers instead of the printed spacer piece. We will cover how to assemble this stock when we assemble the rest of the blaster. Just know that there is nothing else that needs to be assembled here. You just need to have your butt plate and some sort of spacer arrangement. As of right now, As of recording, the only stock that needs assembly before you put it on the blaster is the worker extendable stock. To assemble your to ex- eh. To assemble your worker extendable stock uh, adapter, I guess we can call it. Um, hmm. To assemble your worker To assemble your worker extendable stock, first you take your extendable stock. This is a piece from worker, or you can have a printed version. And if you have a printed version, you would glue in these two bars right here. Glue them in to the butt plate of the stock. In order to build the part that the worker stock attaches to, if you have a worker extendable stock, you do not need to assemble the stock itself. What you do need to assemble is the bit that the stock attaches to. First, you take this green part and take this black part and put it here over it. Then you place this white part through the black part and put a screw in right there. That screw will keep this white piece in place and this black piece in place. Then you take your elastic, push it through this hole, loop it down, around, through this hole, down, through this hole, and back up to the top. At this point, you then tie the two pieces of elastic together into a loop. Make sure that the knot is nice and tight, and then tie a second knot over it to make sure that it doesn't come undone. This provides spring force to this latch, which lets you extend and unextend the worker stock while keeping it in place once it is extended. At this point, your worker extendable stock piece is done. We will now assemble your RAM. Depending on your version of the hardware kit, your priming bars, which are these aluminum bars, might have slightly different hole patterns. If the hole patterns that you have are different, the assembly will still be the same. Just put screws where the holes are on your blaster. Are they the same? Oh crap. Not. Next, we will be assembling your RAM. Depending on your version of your hardware kit, next we will be assembling your RAM. Depending on your hardware kit, which is balls. Next we will be assembling Next, we will be assembling your RAM. Depending on your version of the hardware kit that you have, poop. Next, we will be assembling the RAM. Depending on the version of your hardware kit, your aluminum bars, which are these, might be different than shown here on screen. They might be more like these ones. You can tell the difference because these ones have two holes close together in the back, and these ones have one hole in the back. Please follow the instructions for your set of bars. They are different depending on which bars you have. Not majorly, but enough to matter. If your kit has bars with one hole in the back, then follow these instructions. First, take your printed RAM piece. Put one -123 O-ring in the main groove. Next, take another -123 O-ring and bend it over these tabs as shown. This provides padding for the plunger as it hits the back of the RAM. Next, take your RAM piece, which is this metal piece. Next, take an -012 O-ring. Next, take a -012 O-ring, which is a small O-ring, and put it in the hole in your RAM base. Push it all the way to the back, up against this face. Next, take your metal RAM and push it into the hole. Make sure that it is seated tightly up against the O-ring, but it is not pushing the O-ring out the back of the hole. You want the O-ring to stay inside of the hole and have the RAM seal up against it. Next, put in 2 screws. There are 4 screws shown here, but just put in 2. Put in 1 screw on the top and 1 screw on the bottom. These 2 screws hold the RAM in place. Once these screws are in, make sure that you cannot easily pull the RAM out of the RAM base. If you can pull it easily out of the RAM base, even with the screws fully tightened, you might need to glue in your RAM. That is not ideal, but it might be necessary. If you wish that to be reversible, use hot glue. Next, put your priming bars onto your RAM. Then, put a screw in each hole on each side. Next, take 1 or 2 more 012 O-rings, which are the small ones, and push them over the front of the RAM into this groove. This will seal the breech. When we assemble the RAM into the blaster, we will put a little bit of lubricant on these O-rings here to make sure that it goes in and out of the breech smoothly. At this point, your RAM is finished. If your RAM has 2 screws at the back, follow these instructions. First, take your large piece of your RAM base, which is this piece. Push your RAM in through the front of it so it sits flat with the back. Next, put 2 screws into the RAM. One screw goes here in the bottom of the ram base. The other screws go here in the top of the ram base. These two screws help lock in the ram. No, that is wrong. I said the wrong things. Balls. Take your metal ram piece, which is this, and insert it through the back of this piece, like so. No, don't do that. Balls. First, take your ram, which is this metal piece, and put an O12 O-ring over the back of it here. This is a small O-ring, which is approximately the same diameter as this slot in the front of it. Put one O-ring here on the back. Next, put one or two more O-rings on the front. These O-rings will seal the breech and will be lubricated later during the assembly process to ensure smooth breech opening and closing. Next, take your white piece of the ram, which is this piece, this big piece, and slide it on over the front of the ram like that. Like that. Make sure that your O-ring at the back of the ram does not come off. Next, put two screws into the ram. One screw goes here in the bottom, and one screw goes here in the top. Next, take this piece of your ram and place it onto the back of the other piece. This piece will squish the small O12 O-ring that you have on the back of this piece. That will ensure a nice seal on the ram and also help keep it in place. Put two screws in through the back of the piece. One screw there, and one screw there. Next, put two Next, put on your dash 123 O-ring here, and then loop another around this piece's teeth. No. Next, put a dash 123 O-ring here on your ram. Yeah! Okay. Next, take another dash 123 O-ring and loop it in and out of this part's teeth here on the edge of it, like so. This helps provide a nice cushion for the plunger to smack into. I know, I heard you, thank you. Next, take another dash 123 O-ring and put it on the piece like this. Loop it in and out of these slots here, which will make it bent like this. This shape provides a nice padding for the plunger to smack against when firing. At this point, you can take your priming bars and put them on the sides of your ram, like so. Two screws go in each side. At this point, your ram is done. We will now begin assembling the rest of the blaster. First, take this piece of the muzzle. If you wish to secure your barrel with a set screw, take your short 1032 screw, or bolt. It looks like a bolt, but it's a screw because it has a head on it instead of a hex head. Put that through this hole in the bottom with a nut in this slot on the top. Tighten it just enough so it doesn't fall out, but don't fully tighten it. You will fully tighten it once you put in the barrel. Next, take your 3 threaded rods and put them into the piece like this. Have a little bit sticking out the front because we are now going to put 3 hex nuts on the front. I didn't like that transition. Next, take your 3 threaded rods and push them through this piece. Make sure to have a little bit sticking out the front. We will now attach hex nuts to these front pieces. Once the hex nuts are threaded onto these 3 rods, slide the rods back into the hole, which will then capture the hex nuts. Next, put on this piece of the muzzle. Put 3 screws into this piece. 1 screw here, 1 screw here, and 1 screw here. Do not yet attach this piece of the muzzle. You will attach this piece once you attach the barrel. Next, slide 2 rod covers down these bottom 2 pieces of the rod until they sit like this up against this piece. I will recolor them just for now so you can easily see them. Put your 2 rod covers in this position. Next, slide on this pump grip from the back. Then, slide on this top rail. If you have a SCOBAC, which is the sliding clutch barrel retention mechanism, you would first put on your short piece of rail in the front, and then slide on your SCOBAC, along with its slide latch already attached to the SCOBAC. Do not yet put in the barrel, that will come after. Next, don't do that. Oh. Do not pay attention to the barrel already being in place here. I'm just using this to show where each piece goes. At the end of the blaster assembly is when you will attach your barrel using your SCOBAC here, or your muzzle in the front with the O-ring collet, or with the screw in the bottom, or with all 3 at once if you really wanted to. Next, slide on this piece. Then, slide on your magwell. Next, slide on this top piece of the magwell. And then slide on this piece right here. This is the piece that will hold the plunger tube in the front. In between this green piece and this top white piece, you can put short pins to keep it aligned beautifully. If you are going to tighten your blaster adequately so that it doesn't need those pins for stabilization, don't put them in. At this point, you will then put your ram assembly with priming bars in through the back of the screen piece. You can then take your short 1032 screws that look like bolts and put them through your foregrip pump grip piece into these rods. If you have the version of the kit that had 2 screws here in the back of the ram, your holes are not threaded in the priming bars. On that version of the kit, you will have a pump grip, which I can show you, that takes 1032 nuts slotted in to the back of it, and then these screws go into those. Next, we will attach the grip. Slide the grip into place. The whole grip assembly, like so. Then, put on your top rail. Then, put on your top rail. Next, while holding down the trigger, while holding down the trigger to move the sear out of the way, put on your plunger tube on top of the ram. Before you attach the plunger tube, you should put lubrication on the inside of this front edge of it. That will make sure that it can go on to these ram O-rings nice and easily. Put on enough lubrication in the front to have it attach to these O-rings easily. And then when you put in your plunger, you will put more lubricant in the back. Next, you put on this back piece. Next, we will attach your plunger tube. Take your plunger tube, shown here, and put lubricant on this inside front face. Then slide it over these O-rings on your ram. The lubricant will make sure that this slides nicely and easily in the plunger tube, but it will also make it easy to assemble right now. At this point, you would also put lubricant on the back of the plunger tube and put your plunger into the tube, along with your spring. I will not show that right here because I forgot to have those bodies visible when I was setting up this shot of the video. Oops. Next, you will attach this back piece. Put 3 1032 nuts onto this back piece. Balls. Next, attach this back piece. Put 3 1032 nuts onto this back piece and tighten them down. You want it tight enough that the blaster feels rigid, but you do not want to over tighten because then the blaster might bend. The top might be tighter than the bottom, which would cause the blaster to bend in one direction or another, which causes inaccuracies and harder priming and other issues. You want it to be tight enough, but don't really crank on it. When tightening the nuts, make sure to tighten them at the same amount for each nut. So instead of tightening one nut all the way down, and then moving to another nut and tightening it all the way down, tighten them one at a time, each a little bit. Give this nut 2 turns, give this nut 2 turns, give this nut 2 turns. Go in a circle until they are all tight. That makes sure that when they are all evenly tightened, the blaster is more rigid and more accurate, because if they are misadjusted, if they are not equally tightened, one end of the blaster might be slightly shorter than the other, bringing the barrel out of center, which would make it inaccurate. Slightly, but notably. At this point, align all of the nuts so they can go into this cavity in the back of this piece. Push on this piece over those nuts. Put 3 more nuts on the back of this piece. Once again, tighten them in a revolving order as to make sure that the tightening is equal in between all of them, and don't over tighten them. If you want to swap your spring at any point, you would take off just these nuts and then take off this back piece. That would then allow the spring to come out the back of the blaster through that hole. At this point, as you can see here are the nuts in their position. At this point, take your B nut, which is this piece right here, and put it on the back of the blaster. Make sure that the nuts are in the proper position to go into the slots at the back of this piece, as you can see here. At this point, put 2 screws into the back of this piece to keep it attached to this white piece right here. If you have a stock on your blaster, the assembly for this backmost part is slightly different. If you have a stock on your blaster, that is like these parts here, or this part here. Follow your heart, baby. No, that's not right. If you have a stock attachment, that is this end strike stock attachment point, or this, or sorry, if you have a stock attachment point that is integrated to this B nut part, such as this end strike stock point or this buffer tube stock point, you want your threaded rods to be poking out the holes in the back of this piece. Instead of putting nuts on the inside edge, right here, you'll have them on the outside edge, on the outside of this, keeping it attached to this white piece nice and securely. Then you would put in your screws there and there. On the end strike part, you can see that the screws go in these holes. Having the nuts on the outside edge of this part helps make sure that it cannot be broken off of the blaster. You want the nuts to be in this position, on the outside of this piece. At this point, you would then put in these 2 screws. If you have the worker extendable stock, assemble the B nut as normal. Line it up with this white piece and put 2 screws into it. One screw is here with a little window to stick your screwdriver through right here, and the other screw is up here. Take note that this white piece right here is different than the one on the standard blaster. That makes space for these parts right here, which hold the bars of the stock. This piece right here is also different for the worker stock, as you can see on this other messier model. But you can see here, there are relief marks. As you can see here, there are relief marks on this piece to make space for the rods of the stock to come through. If you are using the fixed stock, which has longer threaded rods, at this point you would take this B-nut piece. If you are using the longer stock, with... If you are using the fixed stock, which has longer threaded rods coming out the back of the blaster, you would not put these nuts here. You would attach the B-nut as you would normally with these two screws, but then you would have the threaded rods coming out the back of the blaster. You would then put on your spacer of choice, which could be this printed spacer with space for the fully guided spring guide, which is this thing, or just simple rod covers. You would then put your butt plate over that spacer, and then you would put your 3 nuts on the back of this. Tighten those down, once again, in a circular fashion, until they are all nice and snug. On any of these parts, if you have threaded rod sticking out the back of the blaster, it is up to you to decide if you want to cut down the threaded rod to make it so it doesn't poke out the back, or leave it as it is. On parts like these end strike and buffer tube stocks, I would recommend that as long as it's not poking too far out the face of the nuts, which are on the outside of these pieces, don't trim it, because you might need the future length. If the threaded on the buffer tube and end strike stock points, if the threaded rod is poking really far out the back of it, I would trim it. But if it's not poking past, I guess, like right here-ish, I'd say, don't trim it. There's no real need for it. Keep in mind that the nuts for these ones are on the outside of the blaster. If you have the normal B-nut with no stock attachment of any point, or of any type, trim it until it's nice and flush. And that will make it look nice and make sure that it doesn't poke out the back and poke you. On the worker extendable stock, if there is threaded rod sticking out the back, you do need to trim it in order to even put on this piece. It does not have holes in the back of it, unlike the other pieces. If you have threaded rod poking out the back of your butt plate on the fixed stock, I would definitely trim it, because that will poke right into your shoulder, which would suck. Trim it until it is mostly flush with the nuts, maybe a little tiny bit past the nuts, in case you need to tighten it or loosen it in the future. At this point, once the rest of the blaster is assembled, you would then put in your barrel. First, lubricate the O-rings on the tip of your ram, which are sitting in these slots. Lubricate these so the barrel can go on smoothly. Next, slide your barrel in through the front of the muzzle. To keep your barrel in place, you can use your SCO-back, which is the sliding clutch barrel retention, by just pushing in the slider on the bottom until the barrel is tight. To keep it in place with this bottom screw, tighten the screw until the barrel is kept in place. To keep it in place with the O-ring collet in the front, first you would put an O-ring, O16 O-ring, over the barrel and slide it down into this hole. Then you would attach this nut, this green piece, over the end of it and tighten it by screwing it into the muzzle. Tighten it until it is nice and snug, and then the barrel will not come out. At this point, you can attach a scar or other muzzle device. On this one, it is a nice little decorative front sight, which is from the original Skewer. This is held in place by squeezing the plastic with a 1032 short screw bolt thing with a nut. But this is not necessary. At this point, you should have a fully assembled, and hopefully functional, pump skewer V2. Please test fire your blaster. Prime it back using the pump grip, or an attached pump grip via this Picatinny rail, and make sure that it catches in the back. Then, pull the pump grip forwards to chamber a dart out of your magazine, and fire it. If it fires the whole magazine nicely, then congratulations, you have assembled your pump skewer V2. Enjoy your blaster, and make sure to send me a picture of it at some place on the internet. I am on Discord, I am on Reddit, I'm probably in other places, but you can find me all over the place. I would love to see pictures of blasters that people have completed, so just shoot me a message. I would love to see what you made. Anything else? No, I think that's everything. Is that everything? I think that's everything. Yeah.